The scene was unthinkable. Icelandic police fired tear gas for the first time in half a century to quell an anti-government protest that had turned violent. The people once voted the happiest on earth had lost their cool. Icelanders were angry and demanding answers. Why, after years of enjoying the highest living standards in the world, had they suddenly found themselves destitute in an economic abyss?
People were losing their savings. They were losing their homes. People with kids, people with families, people with, they were losing everything.
And the reason why? Because Iceland had become one of the biggest players in the colossal global credit bubble. And when that bubble burst, this tiny fishing nation of 300,000 became its biggest loser.
It is as if the bursting came completely out of the blue.
You can tell all kinds of morality tales, classic bubble.
In this program, we travel to Iceland, California, and Japan to track the boom and bust of some of the most dramatic asset bubbles in recent history. What caused them? And is it just a matter of time before the next one? Or can we break the ever-accelerating bubble cycle? Iceland doesn't seem a likely location for an economic meltdown so far-reaching that its reverberating effects would extend across the major financial centres of the world. The inhospitable isle sits in isolation on the edge of the Arctic Circle. It's a land of otherworldly wilderness, stark volcanic landscapes resembling the moon, glacier lagoons strewn with aquamarine icebergs, smouldering hotbeds of geothermal activity. Quite literally, Iceland is where fire meets ice, where the Earth's bowels bubble to the surface. Iceland's location on the mid-Atlantic ridge has meant it's always been a volatile place, but nothing could have prepared the island for the instability that was to rock the country when the credit bubble burst. Long before its financial ambitions, the nation's fortunes lay with fishing, yielding almost 3/4 of its exports. And for these descendants of Vikings, their national identity was firmly entwined with the fish pulled out of the ocean. Generations of Icelanders saw their future at sea. Jon Gerti Diagbjardsson began his career alongside his father and uncle.
I started fishing when I was 15 years old. I went on a big ship fishing for shrimp.
After specialized training for a number of years, Jon was finally in a position to tackle the seas alone.
I bought the boat and a quota along with it, and I just went out fishing.
But one day he began to hear stories. The owners of the fishing companies were investing in a different, more lucrative world, the new world of high finance. In 2003, the Icelandic government privatized its banks and relaxed regulation. High interest rates attracted huge amounts of foreign money. The banking sector skyrocketed. Within a few years, Reykjavik had become a mini financial capital.
Iceland suddenly found its little pot of gold of its own, which was to be a banking center, and that seemed like a very stable thing to do.
This seemed like a wonderful development. There were huge profits, making a lot of Icelanders billionaires on paper, virtually overnight.
These freshly minted Icelandic billionaires went on international shopping sprees, buying up UK retail icons like Hamleys and House of Fraser.
Every time an acquisition like this was made, the share price of the respective company went up. So that basically tells you the market sentiment.
Iceland was the new, brain in finance in Europe, and we were doing a lot of big things. So we thought that we were brilliant, actually.
This sense of superiority is a classic sign of bubble behaviour. As a nation, Iceland was collectively experiencing the symptoms of irrational exuberance.
There's a willingness to discover a genius in oneself, so that if we have an investing success, we start to think more highly of ourselves. So this overconfidence can become amplified in a bubble, even among normal people.
All around, tangible signs of the newfound bounty were on display. Luxury imports arrived by the boatload. Iceland's biggest car dealership, Hekla Cars, was thriving at the time.
You didn't have to do much sales, you were just delivering orders. Prices were really good, financing was no problem. So it was easy living.
Many traded in their modest, compact hatchbacks. Souped-up sport utility vehicles now glided along Reykjavik's narrow streets.
We are not talking about the basic Skodas, we are talking about, let's say, Pajeros, Land Cruisers, of course, Range Rovers. Nobody was a man without having a good four-wheel sport vehicle.
Those stuck on the high seas began to think about their choice of lifestyle.
Compared to the new world of banking, fishing started to look less attractive, with many selling on their quotas in favour of speculative investing, becoming modern-day Vikings riding the waves of finance.
This is quite popular. A lot of people are usually on this port here fishing.
Yeah. Or they come down here late at night.
Yeah.
Jon was one of those willing to pack it all in. Though he'd been a successful fisherman, he saw an opportunity. He sold his fishing boat and quota and invested in a wooden floor factory in his hometown.
Was everything going up in value at the time? I mean, it sounds like it was easy money.
Everything was ridiculous. You could get money you could get money on loan for no problem. You could go to the bank and you wanted 5 million Icelandics. They would basically say, why not take 10, invest 5, and it was supposed to be so easy.
The cheap credit was offered to everyone. Interest rates were high in Iceland and mortgages traditionally indexed to inflation. But people suddenly found they could get access to new, low-interest loans in Japanese yen or Swiss francs.
Instead of just being able to go to one place to get a mortgage, you are suddenly open for 3 or 4 banks.
25% of lending to households was in foreign currency. Both firms and households sidestepped the domestic interest rate. This looked good while the going was good.
Icelanders thought they could live on banks, and so they racked up high debts and an even higher standard of living, incongruous with their humble seafaring past. Where once would have stood traditional corrugated tin houses, adorned simply with flower boxes, now Beverly Hills-style mansions flaunted their fountains and gates. By 2006, the average Icelandic family was 3 times as wealthy as in 2003.
As long as the foreign money continued to flow into Iceland, everything was fine. But as soon as that flow started to dry up and the money began to drain away, the stage was set for disaster.
And that's ultimately what happened. Like a classic bank run kind of situation, people lost faith in what was happening in Iceland.
The banks had racked up debts 9 times the size of the country's GDP, mostly in foreign currency.
Once things started to unwind, they were so over-leveraged, so they just got caught short.
With few foreign reserves, the lender of last resort, the central bank, couldn't salvage the swollen banks. Iceland sank into near bankruptcy. All three of its main banks went bust. Its currency, the krona, fell like a rock, becoming virtually worthless. And its people watched helplessly as their life savings evaporated, replaced by mountains of debt. The krona's collapse meant almost overnight, houses bought for $500,000 had mortgages of $1.5 million.
If you look at a plot, their stock market index, it's the most spectacular bubble I've ever seen. It was going up, up and up and up, and then peaked around 2007, and then it collapsed. It's well over 90% down.
After the crash came the outrage, the blame, the questions.
How can a country of 300,000 people go all over Europe and buy everything up without anybody saying, excuse me, what's the matter with you guys?
All those guys who were these business moguls, absolute bull. And I'm pissed at them. But they didn't make the rules. They were probably more or less playing by the rules.
The errors in judgment seem so obvious now, but they weren't at the time, and the whole world was making the same mistakes. In a bubble, people find ways of believing in a reality that backs up their actions.
People remind each other of facts that support the bubble. They suppress the memories of the contrary facts. So you arrive at a mindset during a bubble which seems completely commonsensical and obvious that this is a good thing to invest in.
In a country with twice as many sheep as humans, it appears animal spirits had come to the fore.
You have this herd mentality, which is partly rational. If the signal is all the investors are going in one direction, you have to be both gutsy and very rich to bet against that.
So powerful was the herd mentality and the illusion of success that people convinced themselves that times had changed, that modern finance had found a way to end the boom-bust cycle.
And the way they did it was to say the magic words, this time it's different. And if you repeat often enough that history doesn't apply to you, that you've solved the problem, that you've kind of abolished risk, you come to believe it.
Not everyone was a believer. In Iceland, Vilhjálmur Bjarnason was one of a handful of skeptics, but his gloomy predictions went unheeded.
Nobody wanted to listen to bad news. We were experiencing a fabulous time, and those who stop the party and spoil the party, they are usually thrown out.
You always have doubters during bubbles, but they have no authority. They're saying things that nobody believes. But there comes a point when they suddenly start to be believed, and eventually attention starts focusing on these contrary facts that had been overlooked and ignored.
By that time, it's too late. After years of easy money, Iceland's midnight sun had finally set on the era of boom. We are living in the aftermath of a global credit crisis caused by one of the biggest asset bubbles of our time. It wasn't the first, and it won't be the last. During the soaring highs of a boom, the crashing lows are hard to recall, and Japan in the 80s was booming.
The Japanese bubble of the late 1980s is indeed one of the most spectacular bubbles we've ever seen. I mean, it was real estate, it was stock markets, they were putting gold on ice cream sundaes.
It was a gilded age of opulence and extravagance. The Japanese were in a party mood. The Maharaja King and Queen nightclub in central Tokyo was one of the places to come to flash the cash. Businessmen with money to burn spent tens of thousands of dollars in one night.
Especially in the VIP rooms, people used to pour Dom Perignon into ice buckets, and everyone would drink from it.
But maybe the champagne bubbles went to their heads. They began to believe that nothing could go wrong.
People thought they had discovered some magic elixir of growth. They thought they were on top of the world.
Perhaps it's not surprising the Japanese had forgotten the law of gravity. Since the end of World War II, Japan had enjoyed phenomenal growth rates, even topping 10% a year. Although there's rarely a single event triggering a bubble, in Japan's case many point to a 1985 agreement with the United States to alter the exchange rate of the yen against the dollar. As a result, the yen's value doubled in 2 years.
So as a reaction, government decided to flood the market with unlimited supply of credit, providing easy money to anyone who wanted to borrow. So the corporations decided to buy real estate and start investing in stocks.
Say a company would say, I've got a property it's worth $1 million. They would borrow $1 million. They would use that money to buy a new property, which sent the prices up. They'd say, gee, now it's worth $2 million, let me borrow some more, and they would buy up more property and buy up more stocks.
Japan continued on a buying binge. The stock market quadrupled in a span of 5 years, and property prices too spiraled out of control.
Land prices in Japan were so inflated, in fact, that the ground beneath the Imperial Palace here in central Tokyo was said to be worth more than the whole of France.
Yet, conversely, much like the most recent global credit and real estate bubble, despite the meteoric rise of stocks and land, the prices of ordinary goods and services remained unchanged.
And for that reason, the Bank of Japan said, well, gee, we don't see inflation in the regular economy, so we can keep on going.
The traditional central bank policy has been to focus their attention on inflation alone. Some kind of shift of traditional monetary policy was necessary at that juncture.
And the argument over how monetary policy could or should control asset bubbles is as timeless as bubbles themselves. In the blame game of who's responsible for the most recent global credit bubble, many point the finger at overly permissive central banks.
Around 2003, 2004, 2005, inflation seemed to be rather low, and governments were starting to worry about deflation. So they wanted to keep interest rates low. But of course, we had a real estate boom and a stock market boom at the same time.
The Fed ignored this, saying, it's not our problem. We worry about consumer prices. We don't worry about asset prices. We don't worry about house prices. And that was a big mistake.
For nearly 2 decades, Chairman Greenspan has shepherded our economy through its highs and its lows.
Alan Greenspan has since admitted he was unduly confident in the ability of markets to correct themselves.
Good evening, Mike from CNBC. Could we have a moment, please?
And he kept interest rates too low for too long. But many hold fast to the view that simply raising interest rates is too blunt an instrument to burst a bubble.
Using interest rates against asset bubbles is just a mistake. It's not because it isn't the central bank's remit to worry about stability. They should. It isn't because you can't identify asset bubbles. When they get sufficiently big, central banks have to admit they're there. It's because if you put up interest rates, you whack the economy as a whole, and you don't necessarily even convince the people in the markets to stop.
In Japan's case, the central bank did raise interest rates to rupture its bubble. The subsequent crash was dramatic. The Nikkei stock average plunged from a high of 39,000 in 1989 to a low of 7,000 in 2004. Japan entered a prolonged slump, from which it has yet to fully recover. The destructive nature of speculative bubbles and the difficulty central banks have identifying and controlling them make them an unwelcome facet of a capitalist economy. But trying to stamp them out completely might be too heavy-handed.
Bubbles happen because people have suddenly optimistic visions of the future. A system that never allowed people to be euphoric wouldn't be much of a system to live under.
California in the mid-90s began to experience just this kind of optimism. Technological breakthroughs had spurred a shift in thinking. Buck's Cafe in Woodside, in the heart of the Silicon Valley, became the place where the enthusiasm got financed and fed.
This was where a lot of the deal makers met. The venture capitalists and the entrepreneurs met right here to bust out the latest things.
Investors and technology gurus sat at this very table to hammer out the details of Hotmail. Money was thrown at other ideas too, though not all of them turned out to be good.
There was a guy who, for $7 million, guaranteed that he could have your computer smell. They could generate smells out of your computer. He got funded. It was a terrible idea.
Entrepreneur Rudy Ruano got caught up in the excitement like so many others.
At the end of the day, I think everybody around here thought that they were fundamentally changing the world.
And as it turns out, they were. Without that initial burst of euphoria, who knows if the world would have acquired the tech improvements taken for granted today.
The IT bubble is actually a very good cautionary example for those who try to lump all bubbles together. What you had in California was something somewhat real. There was a genuine innovation in software.
So the upward movement in the price of stocks and shares and companies in Silicon Valley wasn't purely financial. It reflected a rational optimism about what these companies were going to achieve.
Ultimately, though, the optimism became irrational, and some inevitably lost out. The IT bubble popped in 2000. The Nasdaq plummeted 6% in 9 days. The aftershocks, however, weren't as severe as with Iceland or Japan.
When the bubble came down, it didn't have the same horrible effects. It was limited in location, and things didn't go to zero. I mean, obviously there were some tech companies that went under, but equally obviously a lot of the IT was still there.
In Iceland, life after the bubble is just beginning. The grand plans for the future have been discarded and lie abandoned as physical scars on the landscape. This was supposed to be an exclusive community in Reykjavik's suburbs. Roads had been partially laid down. Construction on homes started. Now they sit empty. The money to finish them washed away. For the people, the sense of betrayal and anger still lingers. But it's also a time for reflection. With a long tradition of creative pursuits, Iceland's artists now turn their attention to the story of how their once booming economy capsized. One of Iceland's best-known writers, Einar Moa Gudmundsson, has chosen to focus on the positive side of the experience.
You could say that people have become closer. They've needed to stand together. There's been a change of attitude, something you can't measure or weigh, but it is there.
In the wake of the protests, the country's coalition government crumbled. The new ministers are still dealing with the immediate fallout, but they too are contemplating the lessons learned.
The
The idea that Iceland could build up an international banking sector that made the whole country rich in a few years was simply too good to be true, and of course it wasn't true.
Rather than making money out of thin air, Iceland is hoping to heat up its economy again by capitalizing on its valuable natural assets, like harnessing its abundant geothermal energy and boosting its tourism sector. And Icelanders are looking back to the sea, returning to what they know best, something they have done for centuries, something more substantive than paper money dreams. Jon Gerti Djagbjardsson doesn't own his boat anymore. He's working once again as a deckhand.
A Prime Minister of yours said that people have to stop trying to be bankers and go back to being fisher people.
Yeah, I agree with that, and hopefully we will learn that. This is what we're all about, fishing. This is what is going to get us out of this, in many ways.
The memory of the bubble will live in Iceland's collective conscience for many years to come. But history tells us these lessons won't be retained forever.
To some extent, bubbles occur only infrequently because we do learn for a while from the experience. But the next generation or the next couple of generations might not see it.
Yet some argue that asset-backed bubbles are now being invented at warp speeds, that our economy has become a perpetual bubble-blowing machine. Could the next bubble already be expanding?
When people say, is another bubble coming, I'm rather tempted to say we should be so lucky. You're assuming this thing is over. You're assuming we're out of the depression and all we need to do is find the next asset class to bid up in price. And I think that's premature. While some people detect green shoots of recovery, I see an ongoing crisis of excessive leverage in households, an ongoing crisis in real estate, a major crisis in global trade. It ain't over.
And so we wait and watch the horizon for signs of the next asset bubble.